Hi, my name is Monica Harrold. I'm a member of the Southern Michigan Conference Race and Justice Initiative team. I'm a member also of New Beginnings Community Church of Washtenaw County, which is a Free Methodist society in Ann Arbor. I have the pleasure of interacting with many of you through the discussion groups from our first two modules. In these modules, we shared with you the biblical basis for justice and did a deep dive into systemic racism. You shared many questions with us during those discussions. You talked, we listened. As a result, we are entitling this module, Since You Asked. We have taken your questions and will try to answer them in these videos and during the ensuing discussion sessions. While we know we are not able to answer all of your questions, we've tried to synthesize the ones we received, and our team members will address them in this, our final module. So, my first question is, what is the goal of this training? In June 2020, Superintendent Bruce Rhodes wrote a powerful, courageous letter addressing the issues of gender and racial disparity that still exist in our denomination. He spoke of the eloquent wording found in the 2019 Book of Discipline on the dignity and worth of persons that speaks against these issues. Part of that discourse reads, "Racism represents a particularly egregious affront to the dignity and worth of persons, and its presence is manifest in the life, history, and institutions of all nations. Racial oppression in all its forms continue to exact harm throughout the world, distorting the dignity of persons and God's love for the great multitude of all nations. The Free Methodist Church was itself born out of a desire to stand against the evil of slavery, and we continue to recognize the sin of racism and oppose it in all its forms. In light of this and the state of our nation, Superintendent Rhodes commissioned this team to develop training and resources that would bring awareness to and discourse about the issues of racism and injustice in our society and our church. He informed all of our leaders that our conference would be hosting conference-wide panel discussions by Zoom meetings, which will be led by some of our African American brothers and sisters who serve in the Southern Michigan Conference. He said he expects our pastors to clear their schedules and to fully participate in these meetings. Therefore, the goal of this training, based on the Book of Discipline proclamation and the superintendent's expectations, is to help inform, affirm, educate, equip, and empower the leaders of the Southern Michigan Conference so that they are able to identify, expose, address, and denounce racism and injustice in all their forms, especially within the church, and to make those under their charge aware of the manifestations, both overt and covert, of the assault on the dignity and worth of those who are affronted by these evils. The goal is also to provide resources to help you feel more confident as you do this important kingdom work. The goal is to further challenge us to act with courage and conviction to uphold what is good, true, and right, and to speak and act against those instances of racism and injustice that we witness and encounter. May God bless and embolden us to do so. So the second question I received was, what is unconscious bias and what can I do about it? Unconscious bias is the set of underlying attitudes and stereotypes that we attribute to another person or group of people that are so deeply embedded that they affect how we understand and engage with a person or a group. It is also called implicit bias. It is what triggers the automatic response, usually negative, that we have when we see or hear certain people or things. Unconscious bias is deeply ingrained. Ironically, it is often incompatible with our conscious values. Tim Wise is a white anti-racist activist, and he shared two examples of this in his writing and speaking. He wrote about how his mother and grandmother spent their lives teaching him about the evils of racism and about the value of all people. But when his grandmother was afflicted with Alzheimer's and was being cared for by Black workers in a nursing home, she would regularly call them the N-word. He also shares the story of boarding an airplane, glancing into the cockpit, and noticing that both pilots were African American. His immediate thought was, "I hope we land safely." He lamented the fact that he earned his living speaking against racism and teaching anti-racism, and he deeply believes in what he teaches. Yet, his unconscious bias was triggered by what he saw. His response was a result of a deeply ingrained belief and teaching that black people are incompetent. We all have implicit biases. When they become particularly harmful is when they cause us to act in ways that prevent people from receiving fair treatment and equal access, and when they prevent people from enjoying and participating in the very privileges that those who hold these views receive. What can we do about unconscious bias? Since it is something we have no control over, the best thing we can do is to combat unconscious bias by consciously working to overcome the ideas and beliefs that we have and have been exposed to that feeds our biases. For example, refuse to laugh at the jokes. Speak up when you hear family, friends, or acquaintances express racist ideas or beliefs. Be intentional about refusing to let racially inappropriate thoughts or racist ideas linger in your thoughts and in your spirit. It is difficult work. Unconscious biases are strongholds. But 2 Corinthians 10:14 tells us, "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds." We can trust God to actualize His word in our hearts, minds, and spirits. Question 3. What about black racism or black prejudice against white people? I think it's important to distinguish between racism, especially systemic racism, and prejudice. Prejudice is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. Images that you have seen in the media or ideas that you have been told or taught by someone else can create prejudice. Racism is the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially so as to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another. It includes the use of power and privileges of a dominant racial group to disadvantage, disenfranchise, and oppose those outside of their group. Racism is incorporated into a system of beliefs, behaviors, and laws that impact the lives of people for benefit or detriment, depending on which racial or social group they belong. To answer the question, just like white prejudice is wrong, black prejudice against white people is wrong. Hard stop. No ifs, no ands, no buts, or they did this to us. It's wrong. People often want to deal with issues of race as an individual matter. Prejudice is a place where we can deal with individual attitudes. Because prejudice is based on preconceived notions, challenging these beliefs and asking people to examine them in the light of truth in order to change their wrong thinking is appropriate. No matter our racial or ethnic identification, prejudice is wrong. Racism is a whole different animal. Racism is a system that causes harm to people who exert power and privilege over others. The most conventional thinking is that black racism doesn't exist because black people as a group don't have the power to enforce systems of racist policies or laws. What is important to remember is that we must distinguish between beliefs and attitudes held by individuals or groups and the systems of oppression and disadvantage that are created and maintained by dominant groups to control and subjugate those they see as other. This does not mean that black people cannot hold racial prejudices and biases against others. They can. They do. It is wrong. However, you also want to guard against using this as an excuse or a deflection to deal with your own prejudices and biases and those of your friends and loved ones. Two wrongs do not make a right. The fact is, we must all work to acknowledge, come to grips with, and dismantle implicit bias and racism in our country, our churches, and our communities, our families, and ourselves. With the grace of God, we will. We look forward to our group discussions. These have proven to be times of deep sharing and reflection and introspective contemplative thoughts. God bless you.